Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is October 31st. On this day in 1982, it was Halloween night in south central Indiana. Just north of Seymour, two men left a small house together. The next morning, one man went about his normal life. The other, 24-year-old Clifford Smith, was gone. Days later, his wife filed a missing persons report. A month later, two trappers found his body floating in a backwater pool off of the White River. For more than 40 years, the case sat unsolved, while rumors floated around bars and living rooms across Jackson County. That is, until a new detective picked up the old file, reopened the story, and finally gave the Smith family the answers they'd waited decades to hear. Today, we're talking about the disappearance and murder of Clifford Smith and the answers that took over 4 decades to find. Let's get started. Late on October 30th, 1982, it was Halloween weekend in Seymour, Indiana, a small industrial town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. That night, a few friends had gathered at a modest house on East 13th Street for a few drinks and a casual weekend get-together. Among the people drifting in and out that night were Cliff Smith, who was just 24 years old, and his brother-in-law, Ronald Jack Anderson. As the night wound down, Anderson reportedly went to go fetch something. Witnesses would later tell police that they saw him retrieve a shotgun loaded right there in the house and then walk outside with Cliff. It was close to midnight when the two men got into a car and drove off. And that was the last time anyone saw Cliff Smith alive. By morning, there was no sign of him. Sunday came and went. Halloween passed. Clifford's wife waited, though, thinking maybe that he'd gone off with friends or needed time to cool down after some argument that no one quite remembered. But as the days stretched on and the silence deepened, her worry gave way to full-blown panic. On November 4th, 1982, she went to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing persons report. Deputies started canvassing, checking the gravel roads north of town, knocking on doors, and writing down the names of everyone who'd been at that East 13th Street house that night. But no one was talking. Not about the shotgun or about Cliff leaving with Ronald Anderson. Those statements would take decades to make their way to police. Because witnesses were clamming up, there wasn't really anywhere for the case to go at that point. But then, at about 8 p.m. on December 1st, 1982, two animal trackers working a low, swampy stretch off the White River made a horrifying discovery. In a shallow, flood-prone bayou, they saw something pale floating in the water. When they realized what it was, they called state police. Troopers and a coroner waded in under flashlights. The body was dressed in blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and brown boots. In one pocket, they found a wallet and an ID card. It belonged to Clifford Smith. The body was partially decomposed and the top portion of his head was gone. An autopsy later found numerous pieces of buckshot and ruled the cause of death to be a shotgun wound to the head. Local newspapers reported what little they knew. Clifford had last been seen on Halloween. His wife had reported him missing 5 days later. And now, a month after that, he'd been found dead in a backwater just north of Seymour. Detectives mapped out the narrow, muddy lane leading from the road to the water, marking tire tracks, footprints, anything that might still linger in the soft ground. They believed that the killer knew the area and the remote dump site wasn't random. That suspicion only deepened as they traced the evidence back toward town, and to the small house on East 13th Street where Clifford had last been seen alive. Over the next several months, investigators interviewed witnesses, gathered physical evidence, and followed every lead that they could. But like so many small-town murder cases in the early 80s, this one just hit a wall. There were rumors about a fight, about money, about a gun, but no one gave them anything solid enough to take to a prosecutor, so the trail went cold. As years turned into decades, the case was passed from one detective to another. Boxes of reports and evidence moved from shelves to storage rooms. And for over 40 years, that was the end of the story. Then, in September 2015, a veteran detective named Sergeant Kip Main from the Indiana State Police pulled the case file off of the shelf. Inside were the original 1982 reports, yellowed pages typed on old forms, black and white photographs of the recovery site, and a list of every interview that had been done that fall. He started reading, and then he started over. Unlike the DNA-driven cold cases that make headlines, this one wasn't solved by new science. It was solved by patience and persistence. Main re-interviewed witnesses. He tracked down surviving family members. He compared every statement from 1982 to what people remembered more than 30 years later. One by one, inconsistencies fell away, and this time, the picture began to come into focus. A house on East 13th Street, a loaded shotgun, 2 men leaving together, and 1 gun quietly returned later that night. And it all pointed back to Ronald Jack Anderson. By 2023, investigators believed that they finally had enough evidence to prove who killed Cliff Smith. On October 31st, 2023, 41 years to the day after Cliff Smith was killed, the Indiana State Police announced that they had made an arrest. Detectives took 61-year-old Ronald Jack Anderson into custody in his home in Seymour and charged him with murder. The details hit hard in the small town. Not only had Cliff Smith been denied justice for over 4 decades, but the man accused of killing him was his own brother-in-law. Over the next year and a half, the case worked its way through the courts. In April 2025, after months of negotiation, Anderson pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. As part of the deal, the original murder charge was dismissed. A month later, in May 2025, a judge sentenced him to 18 years in prison. For the prosecution, it wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition. After 4 decades, they could finally say what happened to Clifford Smith and who was responsible. The story that began on a riverbank in 1982 ended in a courtroom more than 40 years later. But at its heart, this is the story of a 24-year-old man who never made it home from a Halloween party, and of all of the people who never stopped looking for justice. But sometimes justice takes years. Sometimes it takes lifetimes. But on another Halloween, 41 years after the night Clifford Smith vanished, someone was finally held accountable. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow for another story from true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!